Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for attending this Fireside chat today. I have the immense pleasure of introducing our speakers today, both of which are incredibly thoughtful individuals in their respected fields and have contributed greatly. Before I introduce them further, could I please remind all participants of Swapcard and the office hours after this session. You can ask questions through the Swapcard app by clicking through to the event page and then live discussions. There will be a feature to ask questions. Abra will be taking questions to ask to Will MacAskill in the second half of this Fireside chat. Will also be having an office hours directly after this. So this will be held in Kepler on the first floor. Now to our two guests today. Firstly, we have Abra Ganz. Abra became involved in EA since her first year at Oxford in 2015. While she studied maths and philosophy, she ended up in a degree in classics. Since restricting ancient Greek to her spare time, she started working in AI safety, performing research at ETH and MIT. She has a master's in logic and is about to start a new position as a researcher at the Yale Digital Ethics Center. Will MacAskill is an associate professor in philosophy at the University of Oxford. At the time of his appointment, he was the youngest associate professor of philosophy anywhere in the world. He helped to co-found the non-profits Giving What We Can, the Center for Effective Altruism, and 80,000 Hours, which together have moved over $300 million of money to effective charities. He is the author of 2 books, Doing Good Better and What We Owe the Future. Could we please have a massive round of applause to our 2 speakers today?
All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Will, thank you especially for being here.
Cool. Thank you for having me. It's a delight.
Excellent. So, just to start off, we're at EAGxBerlin. It's 2023, as I'm sure everyone's aware. This is around 14 years after you originally founded Giving What We Can in 2009. What did you envision Giving What We Can becoming? What did you anticipate when you started talking about something called effective altruism?
Yeah, it's a great question. And can I just check, can everyone hear me okay? And can everyone hear Abra okay? Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I really did not expect Giving What We Can to become like this big thing. I remember very early on, before it launched, Toby Ord, the main force and the co-founder of Giving What We Can, commenting like, oh, maybe one day we'll need to hire the part-time secretary to fill in the pledge forms and post them out. And I was like, wow, that'll never happen. And so that was kind of the standard that I had. And in particular at the time, Giving What We Can at launch was 23 people. Every single person who took the pledge was this huge deal because we reckoned, typical person, middle class income in a rich country will earn a couple of million euros over the course of their life. 10% of that's 200,000 euros. That's a huge amount of money, even when you factor in, okay, not everyone will take the pledge and so on. But that's a huge amount of money. That's hundreds of lives, maybe thousands of lives saved. And that was just extremely exciting. And so the next year we got to 89 members, and that was huge too. And so now, yeah, it's it's orders of magnitude larger than I was expecting.
Thank you very much. Perhaps to come back on that a little, it is indeed orders of magnitude larger than you're expecting, but it's also fewer than 10,000 people who've sort of officially signed up to the Giving What We Can pledge. Do you worry that that is a failure, that effective altruism, despite having got so large, is not working as intended?
Yeah, again, it depends on where you draw the kind of comparison. Obviously, I wish it were 10, 100 times bigger than it was. And one thing that is notable is there is maybe, especially with people taking the pledge, a little less in the way of kind of organic growth. You might think that every year, just from the membership base alone, they go and convince 2 people or something. And then you get very large growth without having to put much additional effort into it. Whereas it seems like, no, you need to do the kind of investment in outreach and advocacy and going on podcasts and so on to keep that growth going. Mm-hmm. However, that might well change. We've seen in some cases, like within smaller communities. So Jesus College, Cambridge, for a couple of years, just had this amazing shift where some significant fraction of everyone in the college just took the pledge. And that made me think, oh, maybe if you can just, within some sub-communities, create it as a norm, like the default, then you can get much, much larger numbers of people. And so often you see with social change kind of tipping point phenomena where no one does X or believes X, and then suddenly it switches, and that's the normal thing to do. I think if we can keep pushing and get it to that point with effective giving and giving 10%, then yeah, maybe we could start to get much more rapid growth, and suddenly it would be 100,000, 1 million people who've taken the pledge.
On that, there are communities that have historically done this. Christians, Muslims have, a 10% tithe in some communities. Have you wanted or experimented with trying to reach out more to them and convert them to giving, sort of, in your view, effectively, as opposed to converting new people to giving in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, one thing we historically found was that it was much harder, surprisingly, it was much harder to get people to switch where they were giving than it was to get them to increase their giving. And if you have this kind of economist rational choice model of human behavior, that doesn't make much sense, because you'd think it's no sacrifice at all to switch where you're giving, but a big sacrifice to increase. But that's not how people are at all. You get very invested in the causes you're already working on. Like when because I was donating to Oxfam, to UNICEF, to Samaritans, and then at the same time I was working on deworming, and I was like, I guess I've got to just cancel these donations, and it was awful. And I did it, many months later than perhaps I should have done, and so on. But in most cases, you can get people to say, look, keep donating to the places you're already giving, and switch where you're giving, and actually, with additional money you donate. And as it happens, I think that's much more likely to happen, I think.
So we've talked about effective giving. That's something you worked on earlier in your career, but you now have a new book, or a book published last year and published this year, I believe, in German.
Just a few days ago, I think.
Wonderful. And that is Was wir der Zukunft schulden, I believe, in German, or What We Owe the Future. So that is talking about long-termism. You've talked before about maybe an intermediary. There are some areas which are useful and helpful both in the short term and in the long term. Could you maybe give a couple of examples of areas you think are really effective there at doing both?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think, this is kind of one of the main bits of criticism the book has gotten from within EA, is just like, it's like a weaker argument for some things that are actually strong on other grounds. So like an analogy, the focus on climate change is about future generations for many decades. We could have just been talking about air pollution, which kills 7 million people every year from fossil fuels alone. Perhaps if we'd done that, actually, we would have just made a lot more progress on climate change. So similarly, I think most of the things that people, in fact, do under the long-termist umbrella are very beneficial in the near term as well. So risk of worst-case pandemics, and it's like, OK, what sort of things are we trying to do to prepare against that? Well, one is just better personal protective equipment. Another is better sterilization techniques. So, for example, research into low-wavelength light that has the potential to sterilize the air of busy areas. That would massively reduce just colds, pneumonia, common respiratory infections, as well as being protective against worst-case pandemics. Similarly with AI, the long-term risks from AI are potentially only 5 years away. I mean, it's very hard to know how fast things will go, but I wouldn't be surprised if we got to human-level artificial intelligence in 5–10 years. These are actually, really quite pressing threats for us. There are some things one can do from a long-term perspective that will only pay off after many decades and involve, therefore, a bit more of a sacrifice. I do think that many forms of social change are like that, where, like with giving what we can, the first, you're working on this, you've only got this small impact to begin with, but you're at the start of what could be like a very large and exponential process. So yeah, so I think like working on AI risk, that extends your life expectancy, because if you buy the arguments, at least we may well die as a result of AI. Similarly, pandemics, even less controversially, we may well die from another pandemic, and working on it now protects our lives, protects the lives of the present generation, as well as future generations. So.
You talked there about social change and how that can have such a long-lasting impact. So far, EA often goes more towards maybe how individuals can have an impact, what they can give, what they can research, rather than them trying to affect political change and change sort of the underlying system in some sense that we're working within. Do you think there should be more of a focus in that direction?
Yeah, I think the premise is not wholly true. So there's definitely a focus on individual action in a sense that has to be true, where all actions taken are the actions of individuals. And so if I say, well, society, and many people like they reason like this, they say society should be like this. And I'm like, okay, well, who changes? Who has to do what in order for us to get to there? And then there's a second thing, which is that are the actions we're recommending actions to try to change political systems, or are they individual philanthropy or volunteering? And it's certainly true that there's a lot of focus on philanthropy. However, there's a lot of focus on what you might think of as institutional or systemic change as well. We're certainly seeing that within the realm of existential risk reduction. In particular in the UK, which I know a little bit better, there really seems to be amazing receptivity to both concerns about worst-case pandemics and concerns about AI risk. And it really looks to me like the UK might lead the charge in terms of safety on pandemic preparedness, where that means things like having regular monitoring of wastewater or other sorts of detection for very early detection of new pathogens, to perhaps have better regulation and gain of function research. And then within AI as well, not only investing as a government enormously into AI safety, but also setting up a system of evaluations. Because if you want to build a car and sell a car, you have to pass like 200, 300 safety checks. If you want to build an AI model and release it to the world, there's literally zero. So instead, we could get to a more mature regulatory environment where you want to sell an AI model, then it has to pass a suite of evaluations. That idea is getting a lot of traction within the UK government, and that's just terrific. And I think in these areas in particular, it's just going to be necessary to be able to solve the problem.
I might quickly ask, and you
Sure.
may have no idea on this, do you know of what factors might be leading to that in the UK government, like the setup of the AI task force and so on?
I think there's a couple of things. One, honestly, is just a lot of, I think one is just a political climate thing, where, I spent a lot of time in the US as well, not so much time in Germany. The US is just this, it's just a crazy place politically, and everyone's just at war with one another all the time. The UK, I come back to the UK, and I'm like, even when I'm not a Boris Johnson fan, and even when I was like, oh my God, I'm so happy that it's him rather than Trump. This is just like a completely different world. But the UK government is just like, it's a bit nerdier, essentially, and thereby more willing to just like, think, oh, okay, these are really important arguments, and let's just work on them, without things necessarily becoming like partisan.
Yep.
So that's been one thing. And then secondly, honestly, is the fact that there's just been, now a couple of decades of people who've come through Oxford and Cambridge often, or kind of other universities in the UK, been exposed to these arguments and are now in positions, whether that's in the civil service or positions, relevant positions in entrepreneurship and so on. Then other particular things, so the fact that Demis Hassabis, the CEO of DeepMind, is highly concerned about existential risk and always has been, is a really big factor on the AI side. Yeah. There's certain like lucky things as well that I think help.
So talking about AI risk, talking about the long-term AI risk and how that might even potentially affect the next 5 years, humans have not necessarily always proven themselves to be accurate forecasters. A generation ago, we were really worried about global cooling and uncontrollable population growth. Now, less so. Given our lack of predictive ability, can we be effective long-termists?
Yes, I guess I want to say two things here. One is that uncertainty cuts both ways. So if you think, oh yeah, we're really bad at predicting the future, well, that means that, say, technological progress can be much slower than we expect. So, we still don't have these flying cars that we were promised as children. But it also means it can be much faster than we expect. So the abilities of large language models took everyone by surprise. Like there's a handful of people that thought we would have AGI by now, but really the large majority of machine learning researchers, even those who are quite bullish in terms of AI progress, just thought that these large language models were far more powerful than they anticipated. That was true for me as well. And so absolutely, I think for any sorts of predictions, like when might we get to human-level artificial intelligence, we should have these big large error bars. We should be skeptical of any particular argument. But that can mean preparing for things coming sooner than we expect, as well as coming longer. Then there's a second part of the worry, which is, OK, even if we're not talking about predictions over the coming decades, but the idea of long-termism is, there really might be things that impact not just decades or hundreds of years, but very, very far into the future. Well, then I think that is true for most things. We don't know how it will impact the very, very long run. But I think it's not true for all, and that's a really important fact about the world, where if the human species goes extinct, we're not going to come back from that. Like, we just know, given basic science, that we won't magically re-evolve. So actually, that is something that would have this indefinitely long-lasting effect. Somewhat more controversially, and the arguments are harder to get into, but values, I think, are like this as well, where I think there are good arguments for thinking that at least at the point where we've got human-level or greater artificial intelligence, what values are influential in society, they could have the possibility to persist for an extraordinarily long time. And so that's why it's those two things that get particularly focused on.
On the note of values, we are thinking about value lock-in and worrying about it, so where our values, either through AGI or another mechanism, become sort of more permanent. And we want to have the right ones, whether locked in or not. Given that's something we're thinking about now from our sort of current moral perspective, which is contingent on various factors, do you worry that we're not on the right track, that there should be, or that there should be another way of doing this such that we can allow for continual change of values and norms?
Yeah, I absolutely worry that we're not on the right track. I also worry this is the sort of issue that will not get very much attention by default. So we've seen this amazing change in opinion, for example, around AI over the last year, where suddenly people are taking extinction risk from AI very, very seriously. To a certain extent, I expected that. The speed of the change was faster than expected, but the underlying kind of incentives are that people don't want to die, so they're going to take these sorts of risks very seriously. But the argument instead that, well, maybe we're just making some deep moral mistakes in the same way that, if the political leaders of the Roman Empire in 100 AD were building AGI and debating what to do, they probably wouldn't be thinking as a top priority, oh, maybe we're really mistaken about this slavery business, or maybe we're really mistaken about like this intensely patriarchal society that we have. And that's a way in which I think things could seem to go well, but we still lose out on almost all value, where perhaps, kind of modern Western liberal thought, progressive thought, is making as deep moral mistakes as the Roman slaveholders were. And so that's why I talk about the importance of trying to delay as much as we can any points of lock-in where, concentration of power into the hands of a small number of beings or agents could be one. The point in time at which we spread to other solar systems could be another point of lock-in. Formation of a world government could be another point of lock-in. In as far as possible, we want to delay those points, keep our options open as much as possible, and also try and reflect and deliberate as much as possible so that we can at least have, as reflective and well-informed and thoughtful moral views as possible at the point of any of these irreversible decisions.
If we were, as a world, to come up with a set of values that we thought were perfect, we've thought for a long time and really we're pretty sure these are the right ones, should we lock those in, or should we allow for moral change?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on exactly how you spell it out. I mean, if it really was the case that, we're just absolutely confident that we figured it out, spent thousands of years, millions of years maybe, we've had every single possible counter-argument and so on, then yes, then they're by definition the best values we could have. They should continue indefinitely. I don't think there's anything necessarily intrinsically good about diversity and change over time. However, we should have an extraordinarily high bar for reaching that. It couldn't just be that a handful of people have all converged on the same thing, because maybe they had all the same starting biases going into the process.
Yeah. Moving on a little from value lock-in to maybe technological lock-in, technological stagnation. Our current way of life is pretty unsustainable. I think people agree with that in various ways. Should we necessarily cut back, allow for technological stagnation to happen, so decrease our rate of technological progress, decrease the amount of resources we're using, and in that sense maybe also allow for a longer period of reflection about values before pressing forward with AI and other technologies? Okay, yeah, so I think there's kind of two things going on there. One is this idea of sustainability, where sustainability is normally about it's normally thought in terms of growth, and the argument's like, oh, we're growing too fast. That's the unsustainable thing. But working on this more and reflecting on it more, I actually think just the current level of technological progress we're at is unsustainable. So supposing we never invent anything ever again, and supposing we even try and live in a more kind of eco way, nonetheless, I think we would burn through all fossil fuels, which would be literally unsustainable in the sense of like, okay, sure, it takes several centuries, even thousands of years, but then we would have to just find other fuel sources that probably we couldn't have. And secondly, it would be like an unmitigated climate disaster as well. Because the idea of getting to everyone to have, literally zero carbon emissions, that's just not possible with our current level of technological development. And so actually, we need further technological progress to be able to get ourselves out of the unsustainable level that we're currently in via clean energy, via, in the long run, like better ability to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere as well. And so that's one way in which I think that this period of technological stagnation would actually, if it was literal stagnation indefinitely, would actually be quite bad. That's even putting aside the other sorts of ongoing risks we have. So having 9,000 nuclear weapons, many of which are on like hair-triggered alert, is also not a sustainable situation. Because one day, maybe the risk per year is only 0.1%. That means in the long run, we are guaranteed a nuclear Armageddon. So again, we need to get to a state where we don't have that risk at all. You did say, though, the question of values, and that is something that's really tricky, where supposing, especially when we focus on particular technologies, so, okay, let's say AGI is going to be a point of value lock-in. It's not guaranteed, but could be. Do we want to delay that by as much as possible? Like, if we could delay it by tens of thousands of years, would we want to? And I think that's a very hard question and depends on whether we would expect continued model progress over that time period or whether we would expect model regress instead. And I think it's subtle, I guess. This is something you touched on a little earlier as well. What are the factors that lead to moral progress? Is it just like having a society? Do they naturally progress, or do you think that there are specific aspects that lead to moral progress?
Yeah, I think they don't naturally. I don't think there's this like, inevitable arc of moral progress. I think it arises out of certain contingent factors. So I think people being richer seems robustly good to me, because acting morally is something like a luxury good. I'm more likely to be concerned about how things go from an impartial perspective if I and my family have all my immediate needs met. People being generally better educated and having like greater literacy. That just also seems pretty robustly good to me because it means you've got more, essentially like more opportunities that people can, for people to provide kind of moral arguments or insights. Having a liberal society where people can protest in the streets, people can make arguments, is quite very like broad freedom of speech. That again seems very good from the perspective of leading to moral progress, because again it means you can get arguments coming from anywhere. Then I think also just like having a virtue of scientific reasoning, where in general the way I think we do make moral progress, or at least often, is by taking our capacity for reason and reflection and thinking about more abstract moral principles, which is something that we have taken from our scientific reasoning in other domains. So those are some of the things I think help, but by no means guarantee moral progress.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I will soon have to bring this section to a close, which means that everyone else will hopefully now be at your disposal. If you please go on the Swap Card app, you can submit questions if you navigate to this talk, go on live discussion. There are 3 tabs, click on the middle one, which is questions, and you can submit them there. Just to finish up, there are a lot of people here and at this conference. There are a lot of effective altruists and people who are also maybe just beginning their careers. Are there cause areas that you think people should really be prioritizing now?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess 2 I'd highlight in particular. I mean, the past year of AI progress has really involved a lot of updates for me. Basically, just things moved a lot faster than I expected. That means 2 things. One is I've got greater probability on very advanced AI systems coming sooner. Like for the first time in my life, I would no longer feel surprised if human-level artificial intelligence came in the next 5, 10 years. That's like, that's like a very different situation that I think I've ever, been in. The second is I'm also placing more weight on the idea of an intelligence explosion than I did as well, where, one of the key questions is, if you make a certain amount of progress within AI, how hard is it to make additional progress? The harder that is, the steeper the diminishing returns, as it were, the less likely it is you get something like an intelligence explosion. And I think the last year just shows, like, wow, actually it looks like you just pile on more compute and you get amazingly more powerful capabilities. If that just continues over the next 5, 10 years, and we don't really have any strong arguments as to why it won't, then the sky's the limit, essentially. There's some good news as well. I mean, I do think the way the kind of tech tree within AI has shaken out is somewhat reassuring from an alignment perspective. Like, it does look like, at least if we choose to, we might be able to build what get called oracle AIs. So AI systems, you can just ask them a question, they just tell you the answer, and they can do this reasoning without being an agent. It's also, like, I think a very fortunate fact about the world compared to how it could have been and how I would have expected it to be, that the leadership of all 3 of the main AI labs are very concerned about existential risk. That really needn't have been the case. That's not like a complete endorsement of them or anything, but the norm, it's not like the leaders of Exxon and Chevron and so on were really concerned about climate change. So those are some good things too. So yeah, more work in technical AI safety. I think even more work in governance. I actually think that's probably going to be more of where the action lies. That means more people going into politics and policy. Then other things I at least personally would be excited about people doing. Further research into kind of global priorities and cause prioritization. It's actually striking to me how little work there really is. It gets kind of talked about in positive terms a lot, but I actually think it's quite rare that someone says, okay, my mission for the next 3 years, 10 years is really to figure out what we're missing, what we can be doing better within broader effective altruist thought or within the world as a whole. And let alone even better to try and come up with your own worldview entirely. And then finally is also just public advocacy. I really think, not that many people try and kind of go out into the public arena and advocate for ideas. You don't make much money from it. You get a lot of hate, basically whatever you say. But if you are willing to do it, I think it can be enormously impactful, precisely for this reason that it's kind of neglected. And a number of ideas there are within the broader effective altruist world that could have someone who's just going out there, writing books, giving talks, is very, very high. And so that's something I'd love to see more people doing too.
Perfect. So now to start on the audience questions, and directly following up from that, one person is asking, your timelines for AI seem potentially short, an X risk stemming from AI. In that case, is it possible to justify the diversification and the diversity of research and effort within the effective altruist movement, and maybe research more generally, or should it all be focused there?
Yeah, so I think it's like the diversification is strongly justified, actually. On the kind of timelines, I'll caveat, at the time being, I'm deliberately not saying any numbers, because I'm planning to just learn a lot more and think a lot more over the next 3 to 6 months, and I don't want to anchor myself. Though I am happy to say that I do think that conditional on an intelligence explosion happening, I think that the next decade is more likely, it's more likely to happen in the next decade than it was in any decade in the past, or I would expect any decade after that point. I really do think there's good arguments for thinking the next decade is special in that regard. But yeah, I think there's absolutely strong arguments for diversification. I mean, it's this very familiar thought within EA that different options for impact can vary by orders of magnitude. That can be because just the intervention is 10 times better, or it can be because your personal fit is 10 times better. I think it's just very clear that you can take one person who's just really motivated and really talented at a certain thing, someone else who doesn't care about that thing, and the first person can do something 10, 100 times better. That combined with the fact then that I think you should certainly have significant probability, let's say that's at least 25%, on transformative AI never happens, or it happens in a long time, maybe many decades. And okay, well that only reduces your impact by a factor of 4 at most, if you are thinking about the other 75%. That can very easily get overwhelmed by all of the other considerations, like your personal fit, or like just other solutions being more impactful. And so I'm actually quite worried that given how mesmerizing, almost like astounding, the recent developments in AI are, that everyone will want to flock to them, and this core idea of effective altruism or some of these other cause areas, in fact, get unduly neglected. I'm actually quite worried about that. And so, yeah, I feel very confident we need to take a diverse approach. And also, the people who are like, there are very few people I've found who don't believe that, even if they spend all of their time like hitting the kind of AI drum. So.
Thank you very much. We're getting a lot of questions. Perhaps next, to what extent do you think neoliberal market capitalism undermines moral progress?
Yeah, I think generally I want to just kind of, I generally in conversation want to like ban the term like neoliberal market capitalism because it's just so broad, where that encompasses like the US and Dubai and Sweden, and I'm like, okay, these are so different, where the fundamental of capitalism is like you have private ownership of property. That's kind of like, I don't see that itself like having a huge impact on the nature of moral progress compared to like specific implementations of that, where in some countries, the rich can just buy influence and engage in misinformation campaigns. That's very bad from the perspective of moral progress. In other countries, you have very intense redistribution, and a much larger fraction of the population can engage in kind of moral debate and so on. That would look much better from the perspective of moral progress. And so my view would be like, yeah, it depends much more on the precise implementation rather than whether it's like a capitalist economy or not.
Got it. What public perception of EA do you think is most harmful and that you most want to get rid of?
Yeah, there's a lot that I could say, probably. I think one thing that frustrates me a lot is this idea of EA or people within EA as being kind of arrogant. As in, like, I mean, it is like an unfortunate fact about the word. So effective altruism, it's like, we're effective and you're not. You know, that's part of it. Whereas the underlying project, I think, is actually extremely humble. It's saying, like, look, there's just so many problems in the world, and we don't know, like, certainly don't know sitting in the armchair, like, what is the best here. And it's a project of, like, trying to figure that out. And even if we're taking action, making big bets, normally that's like, well, we don't know, but the right response to uncertainty is not to just sit in your chair and feel despondent, it's to actually do something. And so I think a lot of people, yeah, sadly think that, oh, the point of effective altruism is going and saying, we've figured it all out, and then like hitting other people with that stick. Whereas instead it's saying like, no, we don't know the answer, and we want to try and work on it.
Yep. So we began the talk by thinking about, or by asking you what you thought EA was going to become. From where you are sitting now, if not making timelines on AI, but instead on EA, where do you think the movement will go? Do you think it will grow bigger? Do you think it will splinter? Do you have any predictions or feelings about the movement and its future?
Yeah, I think one is I expect it to keep growing. I think my default trajectory, not like way higher than 50%, but maybe a little bit higher, is that it does become really quite a significant kind of intellectual force in the world in the same way as the green movement, or even like, you know, saying it would get as big as kind of the idea of socialism or something like, okay, that's quite a high bar, but like as big as kind of environmentalist ideas, I think is actually like pretty plausible, pretty compelling to me. In terms of like, will it splinter and so on? I mean, if you look at the, you know, just other sorts of intellectual and social movements, almost always you get sub-communities in that. Often you get enormous amounts of infighting and so on. EA so far has done remarkably well at avoiding that. It's obviously been like a tough year, and so I think we've seen quite a lot more kind of infighting than there has been. My best guess, again, is that that won't lead to, you know, total collapse of the movement. I wouldn't at all be surprised, and again, would think it's probably quite likely, and maybe even healthy, if as it grows, you start to get like sub-communities within that. Yeah. Not necessarily even by cause area, that's often how people think, but also just by, perhaps it's more by like methodology or even by culture, and I think that could happen.
So just to draw you briefly on one issue that people are interested in, given the consequences from FTX, SBF, how have your beliefs changed after that?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of things I could say. Yeah, I mean, one big thing is, I think, the just distribution of how badly someone can act is like quite a lot worse than what I would have thought before. And that's really sad, and like including someone who has like otherwise seemingly credible indications of like being a morally good person. And so that's the kind of biggest thing, and it's a really sad update because it's like you sound pretty jaded if you're like, well, I just trust people less now. So that's one big thing. There's tons I still don't know, and we'll find out more in the coming months. There's going to be a lot of coverage in the media. There's going to be lots of information coming out in the trial. There'll be books written on the topic. Michael Lewis, one of the leading financial writers, was writing a biography of Sam.
Yeah, the author of The Big Short.
The author of The Big Short, yeah, before the collapse happened. So we're going to get tons more information that will help me make more sense of what happened. In terms of what EA should be doing differently. I mean, there's lots of things, but one update is just, there's going to be a lot more scrutiny and a lot more skepticism of people advocating EA. Doesn't mean we shouldn't advocate it. The ideas are important, as true as ever. But I think it does mean we should kind of double down and re-emphasize and even build into the very core of how we're talking about EA the principles that I think everyone here holds and agrees of honesty and transparency and moral cooperativeness and humility, because we will be getting held to a higher standard. And so meeting that higher standard and being able to legibly meet it will be even more important, I think.
Yeah. One question we had was about value lock-in stemming from AGI. If you think that it is maybe or in some way a random walk where maybe sometimes we improve our morals, sometimes they get worse, would that be a reason to lock in now as like, well, this is the best we have so far?
I think probably not. I mean, I think, again, my best guess is that our moral views are probably wildly off. Like we probably are living, have moral views that are as bad as, the Romans' views on women or slave owners or enslaved people or foreigners and so on. And so I feel like very nervous about any thought of like, oh, we should be locking in like the best thing we've got. And also because like the good state could be that, okay, well, AI is just helping us make amazing moral progress. Like that's not this, and that we do just, have time to reflect and deliberate. I don't think that's this totally crazy idea that we could make a lot more moral progress. And so I wouldn't be willing to take that kind of, it's kind of like a gamble of just like, okay, yeah, what we've got now.
Yeah. On that basis, and where you also talked and thought about AI, should we have an AGI moratorium?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really subtle issue. So certainly, suppose we have this perfectly global, collective, globally coordinated decision where we just stop building new supercomputers for really quite a long time, like maybe decades, or even maybe longer. Then yeah, I'd be in favor of that. Perhaps we would still want, like I think the latest round of language models I think are going to be enormously beneficial for the world. Like I've been using them to learn new stuff. Like it's possible every child could have with this, or like maybe the next generation, like the world's best expert as a one-on-one tutor from a very early age. And that can help with things like AI alignment too. So I think, but yeah, if we had that carefully coordinated world, then that is what I would want. In a world where we're not coordinated in that way, then it's quite subtle. So the thing that I really think is that the date when we get AGI is not as important as how long a period do we have from sub-AI to super-intelligence. So if you look at, so Tom Davidson's a researcher at Open Philanthropy, and he has a report trying to estimate kind of takeoff speeds, which is the point of time of 20% AI that can automate 20% of human tasks to AI that can do 100% of them, and then from there to superintelligence, which I can't remember quite how he defines. And he suggests it's on the order of months to a couple of years. And that's the crucial thing. Like that is not, if you told me that that time period was going to be 50 years, I would be not that concerned, because we would have enormous opportunity to try something, it doesn't quite work, we learn, like we have this like messy process of trial and error. But if we're trying to do that within a period of only a few months or a couple of years, that's much, much harder. And so the key question is, can we extend that time period by as much as possible? So that it's not months, but instead it's many years or even decades at that point. And sometimes calls to stop AI now, I think, could be worse from the period of shortening that like takeoff moment. Because, for example, the FLI letter, like I didn't sign it because I was just too confused about it. But it does mean it's like, okay, you pause for 6 months, and then suddenly rather than just having like 1 or 2 labs, you've got all these other labs that are at the race, right at the race line, kind of ready to go. And that I would expect to lead to faster progress after that point. So lots to say.
There has been a large movement away from the sort of very classical evidence-based evaluating charities towards this more speculative approach, which is also evidence-based, but quite different with thinking about the future and trying to predict it here. What do you feel about this change? Do you think that there is a moral difference between the very speculative sort of research with the more classic, and indeed funding with the more classic methods?
Yeah, I mean, like overall, overall, I do think it's correct that many more people should be working on these things that kind of are more speculative. I think a couple of things. One is like, I've been really amazed by how much the seemingly speculative work has panned out in practice, where, I remember going to these seminars at the Future of Humanity Institute back in kind of 2009, 2010, and I was just so frustrated. I was like, this is just pie in the sky. This is like armchair theorizing about these technologies that aren't here. This is like a total waste of time. I'm going to work on giving what we can and get more people giving money to bed nets. And now I look back and I'm like, okay, well, what predictions would I have made? And I think I would have been wrong at like, firstly, we've had a wide-scale pandemic. It really does look like there's very rapid advances in our ability to create pathogens that could kill hundreds of millions or billions of people. Suddenly, like, we are developing systems that look really quite, human-like in terms of their ability to reason and so on. It really no longer seems like sci-fi, that's very far away. Also, just like, it's now mainstream to worry about AI existential risk. The fact that these risks are now taken as seriously as they are, despite, from my perspective, seeming such absurd pie-in-the-sky reasoning 10, 15 years ago, I think is actually tantamount to the fact that, wow, you really can make more progress than you might expect by having a really good gears-level understanding of the world and making projections on the basis of that. So that's one thing I'd say. But I'd also want to say, like, I think the case for working on things that are just robustly good is stronger than sometimes one gets from the vibe. Like, I know someone who, and he works on, global health and well-being as a grant maker, and he wants to kind of chart this rather sassy kind of graph of like benefit on the y-axis and then different cause areas where it's like global health and well-being, and it's like, 150,000 lives saved, and animal well-being, and it's hundreds of millions of animals, and then long-termist side of things, AI and bio, and it's just this huge error bars that go positive and negative. That's the thing that I think is still like somewhat of an open question, is like, how reliably can you make positive rather than negative progress on these topics? And so, again, that's why I'm partly in favor of a diversity of approaches.
Yeah. Maybe one strange approach. What do you think about ethical offsetting? So like eating meat and donating to animal charity.
Okay, yeah, I've written quite a bit about this. So I think it depends exactly on, so my view is that you can offset carbon and you can't offset meat consumption. Though, yeah, so in the case of carbon emissions, supposing I drive to work and then give to a charity that is genuinely, like most offsets are bullshit, but give to a charity that's genuinely reducing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. If you were to ask, and I do that by more, so I've emitted 100 kilograms of CO2, but this charity will reduce CO2 emissions by 1 ton. If you could ask everyone in the world, including future people, would you rather I do that, or rather I stay at home and do neither of those things? They would all say, yes, I would prefer you to do that. And so that gives you this kind of ethical justification. Yeah. If, however, I were to, let's say, kill you, and then donate £10,000 to AMF, saving 2 lives, would I have offset? Could I offset that ethically? And the answer is no, I think, because
Very glad to hear it.
you can be reassured. And the answer is no, because I can't ask every person, would you rather I do those two things? Because you probably would say, no, don't kill me. And so you can object to that. And then the animal case is weird, because you shouldn't have asked me on a nerdy ethics question, because I'm going to just keep going. The animal case is weird because, when you buy meat, like, what's the animal you're harming? Well, it's the animal you cause to bring into existence via the demand signal of you buying the corpse of an animal that was killed. And so who's got the complaint? I think for animals that have lives not worth living, such as factory farm pigs and chickens, I think quite uncontroversially, then I think they have the complaint. So the chicken that you bring into existence, I think, can say, screw you, I didn't want to live. And that chicken will have that complaint, even if you then donate to animal welfare charities. So that's my view, like from the kind of fundamental kind of moral perspective. That said, I think if I go and advocate, then I would much rather that people eat meat and donate to animal welfare charities than not donate. I'd rather they do both, but if it's one or the other, then become vegan and don't donate, because the number of animals they can help is so much greater via donations than via their personal consumption.
Yeah. Actually, maybe, briefly on that basis, people have talked about sort of animal ethics and how we should evaluate an animal's happiness. And a lot of people sort of traditionally have gone in for, okay, well, we should maybe like try and recreate its conditions in the wild, minus the predators, hopefully. But I believe that some other philosophers are suggesting, okay, actually that isn't the way to make an animal happy. Maybe all they want to do is have sex or something. Do you think that for that reason we should actually change the way that we're treating animals, or change the way that we think about what it means to have like ethically sourced meat?
It's a great question, and yeah, I'll definitely flag I'm not an expert on kind of animal well-being, but insofar as I have instincts on this question, it would be in the direction of thinking that we could give animals. So supposing we have to farm some animals, or that will happen anyway, we can't change that, and we're just people asking for advice on how do we make them as well off as possible, then I would think that, yeah, you can do much better than life in the wild. I mean, consider human beings, life in kind of hunter-gatherer era, it was quite bad. I mean, it was okay in some ways, but if you got sepsis from a wound, that would be incredibly painful. You wouldn't get any pain relief. You might die from it. Life expectancy was maybe 30 years. Your food, like consumption, would be incredibly mundane and so on. And these are kind of, you don't want to anthropomorphize animals. Obviously, it's very easy to do that. But there are some things that seem like they would transfer over, like pain is bad. You can give animals anesthetic. You can tell that. Like, you can tell which foods they like more than which others, and perhaps those aren't the foods they'll get in the wild. So I think we probably could do better than merely the baseline of kind of life in the wild.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. First of all, Will, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. Excellent questions from everybody as well.
Just a flag for everyone who hasn't had a chance to have your questions answered. Will does now have office hours, which we will be told more details about briefly. So do feel free to go to those and ask more. Once again, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.